County Heritage Center. My Ellen Krupczewski, I'm the site manager. Okay. Guy in the red back there is Brent Peterson. He is our executive director of the society. So anything that I don't know, please ask him. But we're very excited that you guys are here tonight. Thank you for coming out. Thank you to you guys on Zoom as well. We do have the Zoom set up, so if you have anything bad to say about anybody, just direct it towards that so we get it on recording. Just a couple quick things. The restrooms are, if you go out this door, there are some that are accessible right there. If you don't want to walk in front of everybody, you just head out that back entrance and around. There's also some in the lobby as well. The Heritage Center, we are open from 10 to 4 every day except for Monday. So any day but Monday, come and see us, and we'd love to take you around and have you see our exhibits.
I'll just watch the game.
And with
listen, because I got people looking
a little introduction for our
with
guests.
Their faces.
And thank you all again.
I don't want to see that.
George Schire is a Minnesota native who grew up on Verne Gagne. Am I saying that right? All right. That's what you get for spelling it out phonetically. The American Wrestling Association and the type of wrestling they brought to the Twin Cities and surrounding areas. He is a lifelong pro wrestling fan that transferred that love into being a writer and columnist for pro wrestling publications and also becoming a ring announcer. And I want to hear that voice later. From watching pro wrestling on television to following the AWA around the circuit, he became an expert on the AWA brand of wrestling and those that cross through the Twin Cities metro. We do have his books available. If you haven't gotten one yet, just see us at the front desk. They're $25. Happy to sell one to you. If you're really nice to him, he will be happy to sign it too. So only celebrities are allowed in the building. So I present to you George Schire.
Thank you, Emily. Very nice. I want to meet me. That was great. All-Star Wrestling. Everybody here remembers it, right? Yeah. And you know, you could go to the matches, sit ringside, and ladies and gentlemen, Saturday night at the Minneapolis Auditorium, Mad Dog Vachon, Baron von Raschke taking on Big Joe the Duke, Larry the Axe Hennig. No pinfalls, to the finish. Don't you dare miss us. Run, get your tickets. You know, that brings up a good point when we got these two mean-looking hombres up here. Outside the ring, these two guys were as calm and collected. Mad Dog was a pussycat, and Jim Raschke, man, I tell you what, if he talked to you as just plain Jim Raschke, you'd be sleeping. He was very boring. Love him to death. Baron is a personal friend of ours, and when you talk to him, he's just very dry sense of humor. But Mad Dog the same way, outside the ring, one of the nicest guys you would ever want. Which leads to the point of they put on a persona for all of you. It was their job to either make you love them or make you hate them. And I think they succeeded, right?
Oh, yeah.
You know, they'd come out on the old All-Star Wrestling, and they had about 2 minutes, 3 minutes to get their point across. And whether it was Marty O'Neill, who I wear sunglasses in honor of my buddy, he did that for the bright lights, and bright lights bother me, so that's the reason. But Marty had to deliver them a line, and then in that 2 minutes, they had to get you to want to come to the auditorium and see them wrestle. And of course, the bad guys, they had to make you hate them enough to want to come and see them get their butts kicked. And then the good guys would come out and be calm and collected. As I said, you know, like mom's apple pie, sweet and calm. Bottom line was, as Marty would say at the end of All-Star Wrestling, all right, fans, run, don't walk, to get your tickets. And before the matches would start, they'd have a good walkout after All-Star Wrestling. They had a great idea. All-Star Wrestling back in the 60s ran from 6 o'clock on a Saturday night to 7:30. And then the actual arena show, either Minneapolis or St. Paul, would start at 9 o'clock. Well, they were a little bit late sometimes because wrestlers didn't know what time it was, but it was around 20 after 9. But 9 o'clock starting time. And during that hour and a half, after that promo from TV, which was live from the Calhoun Beach Hotel in Minneapolis in those days at WTC TV.
It's a recording.
Anybody here remember those?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so they had a small audience, studio audience, and they would put on these TV matches. And usually it was guys like this going against two guys that nobody cared about, except if it was Kenny J and George Gadowski. Everybody loved George and Kenny. But usually they lost because these guys were going to win. And the wrestling at the auditorium was done for one purpose. They got you there, but now they got to bring you back. So when you're sitting in your ringside seat in that main event and the skullduggery takes place, the referee misses everything. He's out buying popcorn. Okay? He misses the brass knuckles. He misses the chair being thrown into the ring. He misses the interference from the tag team partner. And then you're upset. And guess what? You'll come back next week because they got to get revenge. Wasn't it beautiful? All right. One of the things I want to do tonight is, first of all, thank all of you for coming out. It's an ugly night out. It's Minnesota. The weather stinks, right? But thank you for taking the time. What I'd like to do is, I'm perfectly willing to tell stories, but I'd also like it if you have a particular question or something you want to know about a certain wrestler or a certain angle, storyline, raise your hand. I'll be happy to answer it for you. Sound fair? All right. So we're going to start with maybe some stories.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll give you a cheap plug, and not about this crazy book. I'll give you a cheap plug. Right now, if you're savvy enough, go to YouTube and go to AWA Unleashed. Type it in, and you'll come up with, I think we're in episode number 13 right now, but it's a weekly podcast. And myself and my buddy Mick Karch and a guy by the name of Chris Tubbs, who is a producer at WCCO Radio here in the Twin Cities. Chris does all of the background work and keeps us on our toes, but we tell stories about wrestlers, about the AWA, the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of them. And I think you'll enjoy the shows. We have a theme each week, and episode number 13 dropped today. Every Tuesday, a new one shows up. So if you haven't done that, tune in. I think you'll enjoy it. And then, if you have bought the book, thank you so much. You're not obligated to, but I appreciate it. Here's the deal for the book. $29.95 cover price. It's on the back, right down there in the corner. And I will sell them tonight for $25.
Okay.
And $5 of each purchase is going to go to the Heritage Center. Okay? So you're making a donation as well. And then I'll be happy to prove I can write and sign it for you as well. Okay? All right. Anybody have a question or anything they want to ask? Yes. How old? This picture is from 1977. In fact, I was there when it was taken. The Baron right now is 81, I believe. So go back, you gotta do the math. I worked in a bank for 30 years. I can no longer do math, so you'll have to count it out. 77, how old you would have been. And Mad Dog, he's no longer with us. He passed away 2015. And Mad Dog, I don't know if you guys are aware, but we'll tell a little bit of story about him. He, in the wrestling ring, you know, he was billed as being from Algeria in his early days as a heel. The heels, you guys know, were the bad guys, right? And he was billed from Algeria. He bragged about starving in Algeria and living out of garbage cans and wanting to get revenge on people. And he would come into the ring and he would claw and he would bite and he would kick and he would stomp and snarl and spit. And he was running. he was a jogger after he left wrestling, and in 1987, he was out jogging in Omaha, Nebraska one morning, and he got hit by a car, hit and run driver, and it tossed Maurice Vachon into the side of the road. He actually laid there for a couple of hours before anybody had found him. And as a result, he was alive and everything, but he ended up having to have one of his legs amputated.
Right, yeah.
And so I remember after that happened, it was really, really sad to see, because I remembered Mad Dog Vachon, and some of you that said you watched All-Star Wrestling, if you went back to the 60s and the 70s, when they would introduce Mad Dog Vachon, he would start hopping around the ring, jumping. And of course, after he lost his leg, you know, I remember watching him one time walking up a set of stairs, and it was really sad to see how troubled it was to get up these steps with his prostheses. But really a nice guy. Yes.
Where was he from?
Mad Dog Vachon, well, I told you Algeria.
No.
No, actually, he was Maurice Vachon from Montreal, Canada. So he was a Frenchman. He always pronounced his name Vachon, if I could get his accent in. But he was actually a French Canadian, and he represented Canada in the 1948 Olympics, which was where he met a guy named Verne Gagne. Verne Gagne was an alternate on the Olympic team in the 48 Olympics. So Verne was a pro wrestler, or an amateur wrestler turned pro. And Verne, he always emphasized real wrestling, basically the amateur background. He wanted fans to see the scientific wrestling, as they called it. And so that's what his company was all about. He wanted real wrestlers to work for him. And that's why you remember guys like Billy Robinson, and of course his son Greg, and Jim Brunzell, guys like that. They were the good guys, but they were real wrestlers. They knew how to wrestle. And then Verne's idea was if you need a gimmick to get over, well, then we'll work on that. But he wanted wrestlers first. So with Mad Dog Vachon, he had a real wrestler. And Mad Dog Vachon, as Maurice Vachon, started wrestling in 1950. And until 1963, he was in the middle of the cards wherever he wrestled. He wasn't in the main events, not very often anyway. A good guy. And for the most part, kind of bland. Well, one night in Portland, Oregon, he was wrestling for a promoter named Don Owen. And for whatever reason, Maurice Vachon decided he was going to change things up a little bit. And he started kicking his opponent. And then he would take his claws and go down the opponent's back. And of course, the opponent would sell it like, he'd just been hit by a bus. Well, promoter Don Owen, who was doing the TV commentary, he basically said, I don't know what's come over Mad Dog or Maurice Vachon, but he's acting like a mad dog. And the name stuck. From there on, he was Mad Dog Vachon. Well, Verne Gagne brought him into the AWA in 1964. He wanted to see how he worked, got him over as a heel. Long story short, Verne decided he was so good, Mad Dog was so good at this gimmick he had of being a mad dog and a snarling, animal in the ring, that he would be a good guy to go against. And so Verne wrestled him, and Mad Dog became the AWA World Champion for 3 years. Now, Verne didn't trust a lot of people with his title. And it was Verne's title. It was his company. So naturally, he was the champion most of the time. Now, I'm going to make a comment here that I've had fans tell me, they say, well, it wasn't fair that Verne was the champion because he owned the company, and that's the only reason he was the champion. Well, that's somewhat true. But the other side of it is that it was Verne's company, so he was the boss. And he knew he could, that he could trust Verne Gagne, and nothing would happen. And Verne could protect the championship. So for the most part, he was champion for a long time. Mad Dog was champion until February 26th of 1967, when on that night in St. Paul, Verne decided to give himself a birthday present that night, because that was Verne's birthday, and he took the title back from the dog. So a couple of years later, the dog came back, and he was with his real-life brother, Paul Vachon. He called him his little brother. Well, Paul the Butcher Vachon was about a foot taller than Mad Dog and weighed about 50, 60 pounds more. So little, I don't think so. But Mad Dog was the better of the two wrestlers. And then they became tag team champions for a while. Some of you will remember that. The greatest battles that Mad Dog had were against a guy named Reggie Lasowski. Anybody know who Reggie Lasowski was? Yeah, the Crusher. And Natural Feud. The Crusher, of course, loved by everyone for his antics in the ring. You know, his interviews, man, you just had to laugh with the Crusher. He had a name for everybody. And one of the things that he did against Mad Dog Vachon was, because he was a mad dog, well, during the TV matches at the Calhoun Beach Hotel, the Crusher would come out with a bag of dog food. And he'd be throwing dog biscuits into the ring. And of course, it irritates the Mad Dog. And then they have to have a grudge match, see? So Crusher would do things like that and help build their feuds. I would add that the Crusher also did something similar when he was wrestling a guy named, or he was going to be wrestling a guy named Killer Kowalski. And Killer Kowalski was a noted veterinarian, Shire. He was a vegetarian. I'll get my tank tongues up there for a moment. So he doesn't eat meat. Well, what does the Crusher do to irritate old Killer? He comes out in the ring and he's got a bag of carrots and celery and he's throwing it in the ring. You know, anything to fuel that feud. And the Crusher would pull things like that. You guys remember a guy named Bobby the Weasel? Bobby the Brain Heenan. You remember him, right? Well, it was the Crusher that gave him the name the Weasel. And he did it in a way that you would think in hindsight makes sense. He came out with a jack in the box. Dun, 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 dun. Pop goes the Weasel. And he called him Bobby the Weasel because he was sneaking around all the time. And Bobby Heenan would go crazy. Don't call me Weasel. And then at the time, Bobby Heenan was managing Blackjack Lanza. Anybody remember Blackjack Lanza? Oh yeah, Blackjack Lanza, black cowboy hat, black vest, black trunks, black cowboy boots. Heel, bad guy. And he had this big handlebar mustache. Crusher called him Oil Can Harry. Now, if you're old enough to remember, Oil Can Harry was the villain in the Mighty Mouse cartoons. He was always putting Sweet Sue on the railroad track. Mighty Mouse did. Here I come to save the day. There he is. But that's what he called him, Oil Can Harry. So he had all kinds of names for the wrestlers. And just a real character. The Crusher always had feuds. Anybody that came through the AWA, any big bad heel, eventually was going to meet the Crusher. And they would have a series of matches. And then eventually, you know, they just can't contain them in the ring anymore. The referees can't control them. And everything has happened. So the Crusher says, I want the bum in a cage. Okay? So they got to have the big cage match. And, you know, who's going to come out of a cage match? And of course, Mad Dog says, you know, cages are for animals. You don't put them in there. It drew the fans. Those were those big sellouts they would have. And, you know, the Crusher would always win. One of the guys that the Crusher had another great antic with was a guy named Pampero Firpo. Do you remember Firpo?
Wild bull.
The wild bull of the Pampas. And Firpo had bushy hair, big, bushy beard, and he was from Argentina. And he was just a madman in the ring. And of course, the Crusher, you know, you can't have this guy running loose. Mad Dog would come out with a big spray gun. And he says, I have to spray the ring beforehand because Fuzzy, as he called him, has bugs in his hair. I'm not going to get in the ring with him. You know, and of course, Firpo would be mad. Firpo was very intelligent. He spoke, honest to God, he spoke 7 languages. A very smart man. But he was a great wrestling villain. And he would come out on his interviews when he was a bad guy. And he would, and I could never really do his voice, but I'll try. He would say, "It is I. It is me. It is Pampero Firpo." And then he'd be off. Wait to see him get beat. Well, him and Crusher had a long going feud. They ended up wrestling in a bunch of matches. And finally, you know, when it was time for Firpo to leave, and this is something that fans never knew at the time because, I hate to say it, you know, the endings of these matches were predetermined.
Whoa.
Yeah, how about that? How about that? But when it was time for one of the bad guys to leave, obviously the program between him and the Crusher, whoever his opponent was, you know, it was time to go. Well, Firpo was going to leave. So they came up with the idea that because he had been such a wild man and had destroyed so many opponents, he had put people out of action. And the AWA, Stanley Blackburn, remember that name? Stanley Blackburn was the figurehead president of the AWA, and he would come out and order Wally Carbo to level fines and suspensions to these guys. So Firpo was going to leave anyway and move on to another territory back in the day. And they announced that because of his dirty wrestling, his constant injuring of other wrestlers, that the AWA will no longer tolerate him. And he is suspended for 3 years. And it was weird because that was one of the few times that they ever actually put a time limit on it. Usually a guy was just suspended indefinitely, which left the door open, you know, come back next week, I don't know. But Firpo was gone for 3 years, suspended. Well, wouldn't you know, this happened in 1966, and wouldn't you know, in 1969, guess who showed up? Pampero Firpo. And he was upset because for 3 years, now, in those days, fans didn't know that there were 26 wrestling territories around the United States, and that when they weren't wrestling here, they were down south, or they were out in the West Coast, or up in New York. So Firpo had made a living wrestling other territories. He was down in Florida and the Carolinas. Well, he comes back and he's using the idea, or throwing the idea out, that for 3 years, he's been deprived of his income. For 3 years, he has been just smoldering, waiting to get a chance at the Crusher. And he's back to get the Crusher. Now, you guys may remember, there was an old skit. How many remember the show Laughing? They had a skit on Laughing that Sammy Davis Jr. had a routine on there where he had, "Here come the judge, here come the judge." Do you remember that? And he had a judge's robe on. Well, Crusher, not to be denied, he got himself a judge's robe, and he had a sledgehammer. It wasn't just a gavel, it was a sledgehammer. And he was going to dispense sledgehammer justice. And Firpo was one of the first guys he was looking for. Well, they were going to have a match. Well, here's what happened. At the same time this was going on, Firpo got involved in a match with the Crusher and Dr. X. Anybody remember Dr. X? Not Bill Miller.
No.
Dr. X was a super secret masked man that nobody knew where he came from. Parts unknown. You know, I don't know where that city is, but parts unknown. I tell you what, I always wondered about, the promoter says, I'm going off track, but the promoter says, we don't know where he comes from. We don't know his name. We don't know his weight. Fans, he's Dr. X, and he's wearing this mask. He was way ahead of COVID, I think. But this was a full mask. Nobody knew his name. The idea was that the wrestlers in the locker room, the promoters, nobody knew who this guy was. Well, I was about 14 at the time, and I remember looking at my dad, and I said, They don't know who he is. How do they write him out a check and pay him? Or how does he go into the bank and cash a check? Dr. X, what's your identification? I'm wearing a mask. Okay. Well, anyway, so the Crusher is wrestling Dr. X in one of their famous matches. Well, wouldn't you know, because Firpo wanted to get revenge after that 3-year suspension, you can't blame the guy, right? So he came to ringside. He was going to help Dr. X interfere, make sure Crusher lost. That was part of his plan. Well, something went wrong because during the course of the match, Firpo accidentally hit Dr. X with a punch that was meant for the Crusher.
Oh, shoot.
And the doc was laid out. The Crusher stood on, how about that? You know, and he pinned him. And now Dr. X was beat. And he was upset because Firpo interfered. So he wanted revenge against Firpo. So what happened is that when you put two bad guys in the ring against each other, well, the fans then have to choose the lesser of two evils. And I got news for you. At that moment in time, Firpo got the cheers to end the mystery, find out who this masked man is. Because that was the Dr. X's big gimmick for 3 years. Who can unmask him? Who can reveal who's under the mask? And that mask idea was great because he would come out and they'd say, well, why are you wearing a mask? And his comment would be, I have this mask on because if every wrestler here knew who I was, they wouldn't wrestle me. And I couldn't get the big matches because of my reputation. So I've got a mask on, and that's all you need to know. So now the fans are behind Firpo to maybe he's the one that can take the mask off the masked man. Well, the bottom line was, Dr. X wasn't ready to leave yet. He still had a couple years here, so he wasn't going to lose. But the weird thing that happened was that the fans were cheering Pampero Firpo. So, remember I told you about Mad Dog Vachon and the Crusher. They always hated each other. And the Crusher and the Bruiser, Dick the Bruiser, who storyline was that him and Crusher were cousins. They never discovered this until 1963. They've been in the business for 12 years. But they found out they were cousins. Not really. But they looked alike. And it was kind of like the old Patty Duke show. They look alike, they sound alike, that sort of thing. Well, Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher were the tag team champions at the time. And here comes Mad Dog Vachon with his little brother Butcher. And they won the championship. So we're back to that Crusher Mad Dog feud again. Well, the Crusher, he says, Bruiser's busy. I'm not going to bother him. I can beat Mad Dog and Butcher anytime I want. I don't need a partner. What does Bobby Carbo do? Crusher, you need to have a partner. So the Crusher, he says, okay. And they do this for about 3 weeks. They let you hang. Who's the Crusher's partner going to be? He said the Crusher, he's not going to bring in the Bruiser because they don't deserve a title. So one night on All-Star Wrestling, we've got a stool sitting there. And over the stool, there's somebody sitting with a big old towel, blanket, curtain over him. And we don't know who it is. But the Crusher pulls a coup. He's got a surprise. Who's his partner? And he pulls it off, and we hear, "Oh yeah!" Lo and behold, Pampero Firpo. Now you go, wait a minute. How can the Crusher and Firpo coexist in a match? Well, the answer is simple. Even though they hate each other, they hate Mad Dog Vachon more. See, so it's a natural thing to team up and end the career of a mutual enemy. But then you always have that little antic because the fans at ringside say, can the Crusher trust Firpo? Is Firpo going to turn against him? Is the Crusher going to be in the ring against 3 opponents, Mad Dog, Butcher, and Firpo? So that there's that, intrigue to the story. But they did beat the Vachons and delayed their winning the tag team title for a little bit. And the Vachons eventually went on to win the tag team championship. Now they did it in Chicago at the International Amphitheater in August of 1969. And it was finally time for the Vachons to become the AWA tag team champions. And you know what they did? in that match, they injured the Crusher. Seriously, they put the guy out of action. And the Bruiser, well, he had his own territory to wrestle in. He promoted in the Indianapolis territory, so he wasn't going to be here anyway. But from August of '69 to January of 1970, the Crusher's nowhere to be found. And we hear every once in a while on TV that, you know, the Crusher's injured. We don't know when he's going to be back. It's rumored that his back was injured badly in that Vachon battle. Well, I will tell you that behind the scenes, the Crusher really wasn't hurt. I know, really. He wasn't really hurt. But Crusher liked to take his little vacations from the ring. And so whenever he wanted to be gone for a month or 2 or 3, he would tell Verne Gagne, just have me get injured and I'll be able to be gone. And of course, when he comes back, he's already got a feud to come back on. Well, when the Crusher came back in January of '70, now this is something that you people that are savvy on YouTube, you can go to this and you type in the Crusher versus Mad Dog Vachon. And what happened is that Mad Dog, first of all, said that he's not going to wrestle the Crusher anymore. And he's not going to give him and Bruiser or anybody a title shot. Crusher beat Butcher Vachon in a singles match. So now it was time for Mad Dog. Well, the Vachon brothers were wrestling on a TV match at the Calhoun Beach Hotel. And this is the YouTube one I'm talking about now. The Vachons were wrestling against Edouard Carpentier, you remember that name? Flying Frenchman. And a guy named Bruce Kirk, average middle of the card guy, put together team. Well, during the course of the match, they injured poor Bruce Kirk. Then the Vachons were attempting to double team and injure poor Carpentier. And who comes out from behind the curtain in his street clothes but the Crusher? And he was going to settle this right here. He comes into the ring. The Vachons try to double team him. They rip off his clothes. Mad Dog gets thrown out of the ring. He hits his head on the ringside table. Oh my gosh. He gets up and he's cut. Now, the cutting, I know this is going to destroy it too. They did it themselves.
What?
But Mad Dog, on this particular night, as he was doing this little cut on his forehead, as he was doing it, the Crusher stomped on him, and his head hit the table, and he absolutely missed and hit an artery.
Oh.
True story. This is true. This is why I want you to look at the YouTube video if you don't mind seeing a little bit of blood. And it's real. But Mad Dog got back in the ring, and the Crusher really wasn't aware of what had happened because that wasn't part of this program. And you can see on the video where the Crusher is punching him and Mad Dog's head is just squirting. Okay? And Roger Kent, the ringside announcer, he goes into out of storyline and said, we need to get some pressure on the Mad Dog. He's really injured. And that ended the match. Now, here's what happened. It actually played into their continuing feud because wrestling would always do this. Whatever happened, they would continue. So Mad Dog and Butcher were scheduled that night to wrestle, or actually Mad Dog was scheduled to wrestle the Crusher in the Minneapolis auditorium. And of course, he was taken to the hospital. This is true. Some things in wrestling are true. He was taken to the hospital and he wasn't able to wrestle that night. So they had to change the card. And they ended up putting the Crusher and Edouard Carpentier in a tag team match against Larry Pretty Boy Hennig and Luscious Lars Anderson as a makeshift main event. But then, of course, when Mad Dog comes back, they've got their ready-made feud. For the next 3 months, the matches between the Mad Dog and the Crusher were virtually selling out all over the AWA. And the AWA, you know, what you saw here, everybody saw in their own respective towns, but we had no access in those days like we do today with the internet. You know, you can find out things instantly. They could never keep things a secret today because it's out there right away. But the Mad Dog and the Crusher made a lot of money up into around the month of April. They started doing the dreaded cage match again all over the AWA, which again would end their program for a while until somewhere down the road. So that's kind of the way things were promoted back in those days. And it was always about a storyline. And I will add one more thing since we had Mad Dog, and none of this was planned. Emily, she put this picture up there, so I just am picking things to talk about from this picture. I didn't know she was going to do this. But Mad Dog was always a mortal enemy of Verne Gagne. And they had classic matches, you know, and Verne, as I mentioned in my book, it was interesting about the Mad Dog and the Verne Gagne feud because you literally had two distinctively opposite ring styles. Of course, the Mad Dog, you know, the growling, biting, stomping, kicking, spitting, snarling bad guy who didn't listen to the referee, who did everything illegal. And then you had Verne Gagne, you know, who, as I described, was literally the mom's apple pie good guy. And he was from Minnesota. Everybody loved him. Go for champion football player. You know, Verne Gagne couldn't do no wrong. Well, Verne Gagne was in a program in 1978 with Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson, who at the time were the AWA Tag Team Champions. And Verne had teamed up with Billy Robinson. Can you come up with a better team than Verne Gagne and Billy Robinson? I mean, these guys really could wrestle. And they razzle-dazzled the fans with their flying head scissors and drop kicks and, you know, really a good team. But, you know, Ray the Crippler Stevens and Pat Patterson, they cheated. I know, you don't believe it, do you? But they were so mean, they were so rough that they put Billy Robinson out of action. Now, again, just bear in mind that was time for Billy to move out of that program and be injured for a little bit and then come back. But Verne Gagne, he's dismayed, you know. I can't beat these guys. They're running roughshod over the opponents. They're the tag team champions. We cannot have this. They've injured my partner, Billy Robinson. He says, I have decided I got to come up with a partner that can fight dirty like them. Well, they played this out for a couple of weeks, you know. What is Verne talking about? Who's he going to get? Well, wouldn't you know, he comes out with a guy he hates more than anybody. It's Mad Dog again. And it was a natural because you definitely had that same storyline where these guys don't like each other. They have battered each other from pillar to post, ring post to ring post, town to town, and now they're going to be tag team partners? Can Verne trust the dog of all people? Well, not only did they win over Ray Stevens and Patterson, they took the tag team title from them. And then for the next year, Verne and the Mad Dog were popular champions. And just to finish that out, they held the title for about a year. And that brings us up to about 1980. And Verne Gagne decided that he wanted to have his singles title back one more time. Even though he was in his 50s, he decided that it was time to take it back from Nick Bockwinkel, who had been the champion for 5 years. And you know, everybody knows Nick Bockwinkel. He was not a nice wrestler, was he? No. No. He could talk. And with Bobby, I was going to say the Weasel. With Bobby the Brain Heenan as his cohort, he kept that title for 5 years. Well, Verne decided he was going to take it back. And here's the backstory on that. Verne had decided he was going to retire from pro wrestling. You know, like I said, he was in his 50s. He was close to 55 or so. And he wanted to have one more run as champion. It was his ego. So he beat Nick Bockwinkel in Chicago in June of 80. And it was announced right from the beginning that he planned to retire And his first comment was, I will retire when I lose my next match. Well, he kept winning for the next year. But finally, he had announced a retirement. May 10th, 1981. Win or lose, he was going to retire. And his opponent that night was going to be the #1 contender, the former champion, the most logical, Nick Bockwinkel. Well, here's where the great storyline comes in. This is like something a movie is made of. You've got this storied career of Verne Gagne, the college athlete, the amateur, the great professional wrestler, a storied career, admired by everyone. And of course, the line from fans, can he retire as champion? And that's a movie. Let me tell you, that's a movie. Because you'd be rooting for him to really fulfill this destiny. Well, of course, and because he planned it, he won. And Nick lost. But Verne Gagne did indeed retire that night on May 10th, 1981. And the great Stanley Blackburn came forward and had to make an edict here. You know, we don't have a champion. And to hold a tournament with a bunch of challengers would be just too long and lengthy. And the AWA has matches that were signed for title matches. So Stanley had to make a decision. We're going to put the title back on the most logical former champion, Nick Bockwinkel. Now that didn't set well with fans because you know what? He shouldn't have been handed the title, right? He should have had to wrestle someone in an elimination match or anything to determine a new title holder. But Verne turned that into a genius move as well. Of course, the fans didn't understand it behind the scenes, but here was that genius move. While they were upset, fans, that Nick Bockwinkel had it handed to him, they came up with the idea that he would defend the title to Sheik Adnan al-Kaisi. Everybody remember the Sheik? From Baghdad, Iraq. And the Sheik, he was out there with his big sword and he was bragging that he was going to take the title back to Baghdad and America would never see it again. And he's going to beat Nick Bockwinkel. Well, you know what? This is America. So the fans get into the arena, and for those series of matches with the Sheik, guess who they cheered? Nick Bockwinkel. But here's what they had to do. There's one thing they had to do to really make the fans get behind Nick. In the first match between the Sheik and Nick came to ringside with Bobby the Brain Heenan. Well, Bobby is hated. And I'm going to tell you right now, in his entire career, Bobby Heenan was never cheered anywhere, never a fan favorite, and they just weren't going to let it happen. And Bobby didn't want to ever be a babyface. The babyface is the good guy. So during this first match between the Sheik and Nick, Bobby Heenan came out, and before the match, the Sheik attacked Bobby Heenan with his sword, hitting him in the forehead, busting Bobby Heenan open. And you know what? They had to carry Bobby back to the dressing room. So Nick now had to go it alone. But this was the genius of it. They needed to eliminate Bobby Heenan because otherwise, I don't know if they would have cheered the Sheik, but they weren't going to cheer Bobby Heenan. And so they got him out of there, and then Nick was the hero. They had 4 matches against each other, and to this day, I am inclined to say when I've asked about my favorite matches, the Sheik-Nick matches were so good. Because they played it up so well that the Sheik was going to take the title to Baghdad, and we'd never see the AWA title, the world title. You can't let that happen. So that's some of the way the storylines go. With that, I've rattled on for a few minutes, and I can continue, but if anybody has any questions, everybody's hand goes up. Yes, sir.
Did Stan,
Dan, right?
Yep.
Okay, Dan.
Did Stan Hansen really run over the belt when he left?
Can I ask you a question? Are you insinuating that something that happened in wrestling might not really happen?
Well, I can see it with Stan.
All right. Yeah, Stan the Lariat Hansen. The short answer is yes. But here's what happened. This was in 1985. And for those of you that were following wrestling back then, about a year before, there was an invasion in the AWA from East Coast WWF, where they started taking wrestlers from different territories. And the idea was is that they were going to, in Vince McMahon's idea, was going to take over the world and be the only promotion. So long story short, Verne Gagne and other promoters in 1985, a year later, and actually this went into 86, a lot of these promoters were kind of fighting for their lives because their wrestlers that they had counted on for years and that they, had verbal agreements with to work for them were now being stolen by Vince McMahon. Well, Verne came up with the idea that he needed to have a national figure, a national name to be his champion at that point. And against, and this is true now, against the advice behind the scenes of both Jack Lanza and Nick Bockwinkel, Verne put the title on Stan Hansen. Both Lanza and Nick said, don't do it. The reason he told him not to do it was because Stan was one of the true independent guys in the business. He kind of marched to the beat of his own drummer, if you remember that saying. And he was uncontrollable. I mean, he didn't want to listen to promoters. He wanted to just do his own thing. And you couldn't count on him. But Verne put the title on him. Well, what happened, leading up to your question, Stan Hansen at the time was wrestling a lot over in Japan. And he was huge over there. He was making a ton of money. He worked for the promoter over there who was Shohei Giant Baba, who was a professional wrestler, but at that point had retired. Well, Baba was aligned very closely with Stan Hansen. And Stan's allegiance in his mind was to Baba because he made a lot of money. So Verne put the title on him here with the understanding that he would still be able to go over to Japan and have his 2 or 3 week excursions over there. Well, they did this for about close to a year. And what happened was that Verne suddenly realized that, Stan's gone an awful lot. I'm not getting the matches out of him that I want, and I can't get title matches. So before a match in Denver, Colorado, Hansen was scheduled to wrestle against Nick Bockwinkel, who by that time, I will add, was a good guy. Nick, and there's a storyline that leads up to that, but Nick had become a babyface. And he was going to try to get the title away from Stan. Well, before the match, Stan was called into, they used to hold their super secret meetings with these guys in the shower of all places, believe it or not. They pull them aside from the locker room, let's go step in the shower a second, and they discuss something. Well, Stan was called into the shower by Verne Gagne, and Nick was called in as well. Now, Nick was in on this, and Verne basically told Stan, he said, I want you to drop the title tonight, you're going to drop it to Nick. That's where things took a wrong turn. Stan said, I don't think so. He says, I'm heading over to Japan. I'm billed as the world champion over there. I got a tour coming up. I'm not dropping the title. And Verne says, yes, you are. It's my title. It's my belt. When you get done, you go over to Japan. And Verne had a point back then that, wouldn't work today. The average fan didn't know anything about Japan wrestling or realize that Stan would be the champion over there or wouldn't be the champion. Well, the bottom line was that Stan said, I'm not losing, I'm not dropping the title. And he took the title belt, he charged out of the locker room, left the Denver auditorium. Well, now this puts Verne in one of those crucial situations where I got a match that's scheduled here in, 45 minutes to an hour, and I don't have the champion here. I don't have a match. So Verne did an impromptu decision. He went out and he announced that Stan Hansen proved that he was a coward, proved that he was afraid of Nick Bockwinkel, and he left the building. And with that action, the AWA has decided that he is no longer the AWA champion. He's been stripped of the title, And we've awarded it by default to Nick Blackwell. Okay. Well, the bottom line is that the problem is that Stan had taken Verne's belt. He went to Japan. And I do have results when he was on his tour over there. He was wrestling and introduced as the AWA World Champion over there. The reality is he wasn't champion, but of course we didn't know that. And Verne got an attorney involved, and he actually sent a letter to Stan wanting his title belt back. And Stan, kind of being the stubborn and arrogant type guy he was, first he told it, Verne, take a hike. The attorney said, yes, you will have to return the belt. So Stan did. But before he did, he says, I'll fix that SOB. He got into his pickup, put the belt underneath it, and he decided to drive over it and then drive back up over it. And he put it in a box and sent it back to Verne. And Verne got this belt that's the jewels are missing, it's all creased. And as a result, Verne had to have a new belt made because that one was no longer in existence. But yes, I got around your story, but that's how it happened. It really happened. In hindsight, Stan's outside the ring now, and he does tell the story, and he's pretty mellow, actually. And he laughs. He says, "Yeah, I did that." So, any other questions? I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, George.
What's your name?
This is a real entertaining evening. Thank you.
Oh.
And I love these old stories. Would you, oh, I'm not going to ask you, you said, would you like to tell us what you know to be the true account of the Harley Race fight at Chestnut Tree?
Oh, sure. I actually had a fan here about a month and a half ago actually saying that that was made up and it never happened. And I'm here to tell you that it's true. Now, how many of you remember Harley Race? Handsome Harley Race. You remember when, some of you remember when he was with Larry Pretty Boy Hennig? Okay, here's a true story. Pretty Boy Larry Hennig and Handsome Harley Race in 1964 in October were put together as a team. The objective was for them to get a title shot against then champions, the Crusher and the Bruiser. Okay, now just a side story. The Crusher had been on one of his self-imposed vacations since July, where he had lost. He was still a bad guy, and he had lost a loser leave the AWA match to Verne Gagne. So obviously he lost, so he was gone, right? And he and Bruiser were still holding the title. Well, Hennig and Race were brought together, and they were pushed heavily as the #1 contenders. And they were both bad guys. I mean, with a name like Hansen and Pretty Boy, they're not really good guys, right? So they were undefeated from October 64 to December 64. And here's what happened. All along, they're saying, we want the Crusher and the Bruiser. And Paulie Carbo, would come out and stumble and mumble over his words like he always did. Says, I don't know where the Crusher is. We haven't been able to find him. And, the Bruiser, we haven't a clue where he is. So in the meantime, in December of 64, Larry Hennig and Harley Race are wrestling against Verne Gagne and Reggie Parks. They had a series of matches. And Verne and Reggie, if you remember Reggie Parks, he used to come out, he had an iron stomach. And he'd have a Volkswagen bus drive over his stomach. You remember that, anybody? They'd show it on TV. Okay? Well, Verne and Reggie, they were out to end the winning streak of Hennig and Race. Well, in one particular match, Wilbur Snyder, Verne Gagne's longtime friend and really one of the greatest wrestlers in the business, most popular as well, he happened to be on the card that night when Hennig and Race were wrestling Verne and Reggie. And he innocently just came to ringside and he grabbed a chair and he was just going to watch his friends wrestle. Sure. Well, during the course of the match, Wilbur Snyder interjected to the referee that Hennig and Race were cheating, and the referee, again, he was out getting popcorn or whatever he was doing. He missed all their dirty actions. So Hennig and Race got upset because Wilbur Snyder was putting himself into this match. And they did win, but they were upset that Wilbur was doing this. So they came out and they bragged on TV. If Wilbur Snyder wants to put his nose in our business, why doesn't he team with Vern and Reggie? And we'll find a partner and we'll take them on. Okay. 2 weeks went by, they're not telling anybody who their partner is, Hennig and Race. But then they said they'd come out and they pulled a coup. Their partner was none other than Dick the Bruiser. Now keep in mind, the Bruiser was a bad guy at this point in time. And Dick the Bruiser, and the reason it was a coup was because we've got the best team, Hennig and Race are telling you. We're undefeated. And we've got one half of the world tag team champions with us. We're the best team. We're going to end Gagne, Snyder, and Parks. I'll get to your story, I promise. This is the proverbial long story short. The short story was longer, but it's coming. So don't get up and go to the bathroom. So they have this big match. Hennig, Race, Bruiser against Gagne, Parks, Snyder. Well, during the course of the match, Hennig and Race are tag teaming off each other, getting in the ring, working the match, and they're not tagging off to the Bruiser. And the Bruiser is on the ring apron, he's prancing back and forth, he's trying to get in, they won't tag him off. Well, this went on, and finally, understandably, the Bruiser was upset. He went into the ring and he took Hennig by hair, took Race by the hair, and he put their two heads together. Race went flopping outside the ring. Hennig was in the ring. He's, dazed by this dastardly move. And Wilbur Snyder landed on top of Hennig, counted him 1, 2, 3. Hennig and Race had been defeated for the first time. Can you believe it? They come out next week and they are livid. Now you see where this is going, because they're going to build up to a match between Hennig and Race and Crusher and Bruiser for the title. Hennig and Race come out and they say, that Benedict Arnold, Dick the Bruiser, we want him in a match. We've never faced anything like this, somebody turning on us. The Bruiser comes out and he says, I don't know where the Crusher is, but I'm going to go to Milwaukee and I'm going to search every bar, every honky tonk, and I'm going to find him. They get to the match. Here comes the Crusher. Okay? And the Crusher come out and he said, now we still have Crusher as a bad guy because he had been Vern's adversary, earlier. Well, they have the big match on January 15th of 1965. Hennig, Race versus Crusher, Bruiser, and they bring in, because they got these 4 bullies, we got to have a referee that can handle these 4 guys. We can't count on Marty Miller or some of these guys, So they brought in King of the Lumberjacks, Tiny Mills. Anybody remember Tiny? He was 6'4", and in his day was really quite the heel. Well, they brought him in as to be the referee to handle this. Well, wouldn't you know, during the second fall, Tiny got bumped by both wrestlers, or a couple of the wrestlers in the ring. He fell outside the ring and he injured his back on the ring apron, and he couldn't continue. We still got a third fall here, folks. So what to do? So they called back to the dressing room. We need a referee out here. Well, the story was told that none of the other referees wanted to get in the ring with these 4 maniacs. So now what are they going to do? Well, wouldn't you know, all of a sudden we see from behind the curtain, here comes Verne Gagne in his suit or his sport coat. He says, I'll referee the match. Well, this was great because he got in the ring. I'm really getting to it, honestly. Okay? It's coming. He gets in the ring and Larry Hennig protested Vern being the referee because Larry and Vern, they just plain didn't like each other. That's a true story outside the ring, but they were enemies and their program was great inside the ring. So Larry protested Gagne because he can't be impartial. Well, the Crusher, he protested. You can't bring this guy here. No way, because, the guy's a bum, a turkey neck. That's what the Crusher called him. So he didn't want. So both teams were opposed to Verne Gagne being that special referee. Well, nonetheless, Vern got the nod, and he was going to referee that third fall. In the match, Larry and Vern got into a pushing match. I am coming to it. Leave me alone. Vern and Larry got into a shoving match, and Vern knocked him down. The Crusher ended up pinning Larry Hennig, and their first attempt to win the tag team title went down the tube. In between that match and January 30th, Verne Gagne and Larry Hennig were allowed to have a match against each other to get revenge on Larry's part. But Hennig and Race still wanted to have a rematch with Crusher and Bruiser. And that happened on January 30th. And on that night, it was Larry and Harley's turn to win, and they won the title from Crusher and Bruiser. Now, it's coming. You ready?
What was the question?
I don't know.
Why am I?
I don't know. I'm just talking. 2 weeks after they were champions, Harley Race, along with, and of course the fans weren't told this at the time, but Harley Race was at the Chestnut Tree Lounge in downtown Minneapolis after the matches one night. And there were three guys that were, let's just say, mishandling a woman in the lounge, kind of roughing her up and that sort of thing. The proprietor of the Chestnut Tree came to Harley. And let me point out that the fans didn't know this, but Harley had been there with Eddie Sharkey and Rene Goulet. They were in there together, but not really socializing together because the other two were good guys, but they were there. Well, the manager of the Chestnut Tree asked Harley if he might intervene with these guys, you know, roughing up this lady. Harley did. He went forward, and true story, and this was in the newspapers, guys. They actually played this up in the St. Paul and Minneapolis papers afterwards. Harley took two of the guys out, literally knocked them out. But a third one came up behind Harley Race and stuck a knife into his shoulder blade in the back. And Harley was then taken to the hospital. So they came out. This was one of the few times when All-Star Wrestling actually kind of went out of the behind the scenes mode, and they played it up that Harley was a hero. He had saved this woman, but he was injured. And he was out of action for, oh boy, it was about 3-4 weeks. Well, Hennig and Race were the champions at the time, and they did have some matches and things signed, but what they did was they put a mask on a wrestler named Tony Miro, who had been wrestling for Vern. And he wrestled with Hennig in those matches, just called Masked Man. And he was the partner. And their title wasn't at stake or anything. But here's the best part of how wrestling worked. It was written up in the paper that Harley was, you know, a good Samaritan for coming forward. And on the night he came back to the ring, at the Calhoun Beach Hotel, they introduced Larry Hennig, and then Marty O'Neill introduced Harley Race. And the entire studio audience in the Calhoun Beach, they cheered, they stood up and they cheered Harley Race. Admirable. But Harley Race knew that that can't happen because he's the bad guy. So in perfect wrestler mode, he got booed, or he got cheered on that introduction. When the match started, the bell rang. Harley was the first one in the ring for his team. And he went in and he just started kicking the living hell out of whoever the opponent, I have it written down at home, but whoever the opponent was, and Harley was just in evil mode. And within 1 minute of that match, the fans were booing him. Okay? And Harley did what he had to do. He had to get his heat back. And that was the only way he could do it. Now, the truth of the matter is, regarding the story, it was true. He did have a knife that had been put into his back. For the remainder of his career, if you ever see Harley, if you ever happen to see Harley on videos or whatever, And I think about when I look at the video, on his left side, in his back shoulder blade, there's like a half moon scar. And he had to carry the rest of his life from that, that knife wound. What'd I do?
He was a legit.
I would think accurate, but you left out a couple things that were kind of big.
Go ahead.
Larry Hennig told the story, and I listened to Larry tell the story.
That could be a mistake.
It was
Yes.
long. It was long. But when that knife came within inches of Harley's heart, and when it hit a bone, it buckled over, and that's how it avoided his heart. He almost got the knife right in his heart down back.
And that was announced that way in the newspaper, how close it had come.
But Harley Race wasn't one to let that in there. When he got out of the hospital, he had a Corvette that he put a bigger engine in. And he drove by a barbecue restaurant where these guys supposedly hung out and shot the windows out of the place. But they couldn't prove it was Harley that did it for some reason. I don't think anybody wanted to come forward and accuse him. So what happens, Larry Hennig gets together with him, you know, and he says, Harley, you're going to have to do something. These guys are going to shoot at you and hit me. So as that went on, things passed. And it got to be a little much, and they moved Harley. Then Harley, you know, go to another territory, went back to Missouri, I believe. And that's how it ended in Minneapolis.
The Hennig and Race team, very, very successful for the AWA from 1964 to the end of 67. And what had happened there was up in Winnipeg, a guy named Johnny Powers, who was a bad guy here in the AWA at the time. He was in a match against Larry Hennig. And during the course of the match, he had somehow ran into the back of Larry's leg, kind of dislocating his knee, Larry's knee. And Larry was legitimately put out of action for a while with kind of a broken leg. What they did to turn it into a good storyline was Johnny Powers was leaving the AWA. It made no sense for anybody to blame him for this action. So they blamed it on Verne Gagne. And it was Vern Gagne who crippled Larry Hennig. And Hennig he did not legitimately wrestle until March of 68. And they played it up during the time that he was there, that he was going to get revenge on Vern. Vern put him out of action. You know, they played that storyline up that he lost income again. And Vern did this on purpose. Well, in the meantime, a month after this had happened, so we're going back to November of 67, the decision had to be made what they were going to do with the tag team title, because Hennig and Race were champions. So the AWA allowed Harley Race to select a partner and defend the title. Well, it was set up this way on purpose because he selected Chris Markoff, if anybody remembers that name. And Chris Markoff and Harley Race wrestled against Pat O'Connor and Wilbur Snyder in Chicago. And Wilbur Snyder and Pat O'Connor won the championship that night from Race and Markoff. So that ended the Hennig and Race team. When Hennig came back in April of 68 to the AWA, he was then back in full mode, he wanted Vern. And of course, him and Harley were put together again for a while, but they weren't pushed like they had been in the past. And Harley, as you say, he was getting ready to move on. He had bought into the promotion in the Central States area in Kansas City, where he was legitimately from. I mean, in wrestling, he was always built out of Hollywood, California. You know, I mean, with a name like Handsome Harley, of course, you know. But he was buying into the promotion he was leaving. So that ended the team. And Larry was teaming with Luscious Lars Anderson. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have any Andre the Giant stories from the AWA times?
Other than that he was big.
Good question.
I can tell you, I don't know that I really, well, I do. I'll give you a story. Andre, for the most part, for most wrestlers, was very hard to work with. Okay, a lot of because of his size, and to be honest, he wasn't really a wrestler. Even back in that day, he was more what you'd call an attraction, you know, because he was big and he was 9 feet tall. And well, actually, they said he was 7'4" or something like that. But you know, so he got over because of his size and his big hands and feet and the whole thing. One match I remember specifically, he was wrestling Nick Bockwinkel for the championship. This would have been about 1977. And almost immediately when the match had started, Andre legitimately put his back out in the match. Now they were supposed to go, you know, 30, 40, 50 minutes in this match. And he had honestly put his back out. He couldn't get up. He was on the mat. And of all the wrestling matches I had seen over the decades, I'd say that was probably the one that is the most horrific I've ever seen, because poor Nick, he literally had to work that match by himself, you know, with trying to put toe holds and things on Andre and trying to, you know, stomping him to keep him down supposedly, because nobody really knew that he had hurt himself. But, and Andre had back troubles from there on out, right through the end of his career. And at the very end, I mean, he could hardly walk, and he'd gotten so big, you know, towards the end of his career. But he came to the AWA in a strange way. Bull Belinsky, anybody remember that name? The truck driver? The out-of-work truck driver. He was in a feud with Larry Hennig and Lars Anderson. Isn't that amazing how that comes together? And he needed to find a partner, and he said he was going to come up with one. And he said to Marty O'Neill on one interview, Marty asked him, you know, Bull, who's going to be your partner? And all Belinsky said was Thesz. And he walked off. You know, nobody knew at the time. This was in 1971. May or June of 71 for Ray. Well, lo and behold, it was Andre the Giant. And he was in those days introduced as Andre Rousing, the French giant from the Alps. And, but he wrestled as, they pronounced it was Jean, Jean. I think they pronounced it Jean, Thesz. And he was the French name. But his real name was Rousing. And when he first wrestled here, his first match was on July 15th, 1971 at the Minneapolis Auditorium. The surprise partner for Belinsky was Andre Rousing against Lars and Hennig.
And he wouldn't stay in this territory.
No.
If they would take him, like you said, he was an attraction. So he'd go to all the different territories for battle royals and whatever.
Well, what a lot of people didn't know in those days was one of the guys that traveled with Andre was a guy named Frank Valois, I think it's pronounced. He was an old retired wrestler. He was basically Andre's handler, you know, escort for his matches. But Andre's contract, his matches were all handled by Vince McMahon Sr. Vince basically booked him all over. And what Vince Sr. would do from 71 on is he would give Andre to a territory. In this case, he'd give him to Verne for maybe a month. And Verne, in turn, would maybe give one of his guys to Vince. But he'd give them to Verne so that Verne could run the circuit with the Giant, and they'd have battle royals. You know, if you have a battle royal and you got 20 guys in the ring, well, they're all big to begin with, but who's going to beat the Giant in the battle royal? So it was a good draw. And then, you know, Andre would move on to another territory. And that's the way he worked. Yes.
Well, okay, making any money back in those days?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, one of the things you always have to put into perspective is when you say good living. I always laugh when you look at old wrestling clippings, you'll see the prices of tickets for the matches. And the tickets will say, you know, $2 for ringside or $3 for ringside. And you say, well, how could they make any money? But you have to bear in mind that back in the 70s or the 60s, you got to look at what the average annual household income was. And, you know, just the average guy was, you know, if he made $10,000 a year, that was good salary. So, you know, if you pay $3 for a ticket, Well, that's the same as today if you're making 200,000 a year and you're paying $25 or $35, $40 for a ticket. Put it into perspective. To let you know about the money, as the world champion, when Nick, and this is in 75 to 1980, as AWA world champion, now again, 5 years in the 70s, Nick Bockwinkel was making about $250,000 a year. So that's good money even today. I mean, seriously. But in fact, it is good money. But back then, you know, that'd be like making $1 million today or something if you do the math. So they made good money. The wrestlers of that era that were name value wrestlers, that's all your I brought this and I never shared it, but these are 63 of the top AWA wrestlers. And this was put together. I actually helped organize this poster because the guy that did this, he wanted to come up with the best draws of the AWA. And so if you look on here, you've got Dr. X, you've got Larry Hennig, you've got Cowboy Bill Watts, you got some guy named Jesse Ventura, who I heard went on to become governor. The Sheik is on here, Hulk Hogan, Hard Boiled Haggerty, Ivan Koloff, Ray Stevens, Nick Bockwinkel, Blackjack Lanza, you know, Johnny Powers is on here, Johnny Valentine, Shozo Strong, Kobayashi, and you know, just 63 of the best. And the reason they're on here is because of their impact. And what I point out when I say impact is the AWA, like most of the 26 territories that were in existence back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, each territory had what we called mainstays. The mainstay was, if you use the AWA as an example, the mainstays were Verne Gagne, of course, Larry Hennig, The Crusher, Nick Bockwinkel, Bobby Heenan, okay? These were the guys that were pretty much here all the time. And all of the other wrestlers that came and went into the territory would eventually, they'd work programs around these mainstays. And every territory you went to, they had their own mainstays, all of their guys were, and they'd bring in wrestlers to go against them. So the mainstays were the key to the successful territory. And if you look at the top row here, it is Gagne, Crusher, Mad Dog, Bockwinkel, Hennig, Dr. X, Bill Watts, Lanza, and Bobby Heenan. And I don't think you could come up with, you know, better mainstays or mainstays than those guys. And that's how they worked. So,
Who put Bobby in the Weasel suit?
they had a couple of situations there. Yeah, it was Greg Gagne who, you know, the whole thing with Bobby, and this is a great story about Bobby. Once the Crusher gave him that name, the Weasel, you know, Bobby was always opposed to it. I'm not a weasel, I'm the brain, I think, I have a mind. You know, he'd come out and tell you this. He didn't believe it, he was going to show you. Well, naturally, when he's irritating all these good guys, Greg Gagne finally came up with that. I'm going to come up with an idea that if I beat you, Bobby Heenan, you have to get put into a weasel suit. I'm not going to get put into a weasel suit. No way. But if Greg was fair, he said, well, you know what? Telling this to Wally Carver, he said, you know what? If he beats me, I'll get in the weasel suit. So, I mean, it was fair, right? Well, lo and behold, you know Bobby was going to lose. That's part of the program. And during the course of the match, Greg had beat him. And once he beat him, Bobby was reneging. He wasn't going to get into it. He's trying to get out of the ring. Of course, they had some wrestlers come in, you know, to try to stop him. Wally Carver came in and said, if you don't get in the weasel suit, you're suspended. Good God, he's suspended. He's not going to have any income, right? So he wasn't going to get in the weasel suit. Well, wouldn't you know, Greg Gagne came up from behind him and put him in the sleeper hole. And Weasel's trying to get out of it. He goes to sleep. But once he's asleep, Greg stuffs him in this white weasel suit. Big old paws and feet. Okay, and a big old tail. Okay, and then he slaps Bobby a few times and wakes him up, and Bobby's groggy and stands up and he's tripping and falling and he sees these paws and he's kicking. And you know, what great entertainment, right? The fans go home happy. Here's the greatest story about Bobby Heenan. He would come out on every TV interview and he'd say, I'm not a weasel and I don't want to see any weasel posters. I'm sick and tired of it. Well, the truth of the matter was, oh, I know this is gonna ruin it for you, but it was Bobby Heenan that had the posters made up and was selling them at the concession stand. The fans didn't know that, but when you go buy that poster and you hang it up and then he gets mad at you, you see it all worked out with the fans. You know, they thought they were irritated. And Bobby's laughing to the
Oh,
bank.
he was great.
It was great stuff.
Didn't he have the suit made for himself? Like, didn't he have somebody tailored to it?
Yeah, the suit was made specifically for antics, yeah. And they ran the Weasel suit all over the circuit. It was about a year ago. There was an article in the Minneapolis paper, Patrick Royce, okay? I don't know if you guys have ever heard, but I was on Patrick Royce's radio program several times talking about wrestling. Patrick loves wrestling. He's a closet fan. But he called me up and he said he wanted to know if I had any pictures of the Weasel suit match. Of course, I did send him some. Well, he wrote up a story about this. Here's the thing. They were doing a poll on the 5 most interesting sports stories in Twin Cities history. And true story, the Weasel suit match was one of the 5.
Nice.
So there you go. There you go. And Royce wrote this up in the Tribune. It was a great story. And I do want to say one thing about Patrick Royce. He would have his Saturday morning, this is back when he was still doing the radio show on Saturday mornings, and he would have his Saturday morning sports talk. Well, a couple times a year, he'd ask me if I wanted to come into the studio and do the show with him. And of course, we, talk wrestling. Before the show started one Saturday, Patrick comes out of the studio. He plops himself down on the couch in the lobby of the studio there. He goes, I am so sick of talking about football and baseball and hockey. We're going to talk some wrestling. So, he loved it. He loved it. And, great stories. Great stories. Did you have a question, sir?
I can't remember back in my history here, but wasn't Bud Grant the corner man for Gagne?
Yeah, back at Verne Gagne's retirement match in 1981 on May 10th. And I want to tell you a story about that May 10th thing too. But on that night, Verne had his University of Minnesota alumni friends at ringside with him for his retirement match. Remember I told you this, they played this up like a made-for-movie storyline finish with, can he retire and the aging champion retain the title, retire as champion. I mean, it was great. So at ringside were Bud Grant, Billy Bye, Rudy Boswich. Remember the old senator in Plywood, Minnesota guy, Rudy Boswich, and Verne's old Gopher buddy, Leo Namalini, who was a great wrestler in his own right, a football player for the San Francisco Giants back in the day, which, while I think of Namalini, I will tell you a Bobby Heenan story. Bobby Heenan come out one time and Leo Namalini was going to be the special referee for a match. And he was upset because, Namalini was huge. But I mean, he was retired at this point, but he was huge and he was known to be one of Verne's friends, and Bobby was upset. Well, anyway, he's yelling and screaming to me, Gene Okerlund. He says, they bring in this guy, Leo Namalini. His last name, you can't even spell it. Looks like an eye chart. Namalini. Looks like an eye chart. So, Bobby always had good lines. Another Bobby Heenan story, which I always liked. You want to hear a couple more Bobby Heenan stories?
Yeah.
Another one along the same lines as the Namalini. We had a wrestler who was a rookie that Verne had been training by the name of Laurent Sushi. That means nothing, right? Well, he was going to be Bobby Heenan's opponent in a singles match on one particular card, and Bobby Heenan comes out and he's upset that he's not going to be in a main eventer against somebody worthy of his talent. And he says, they give me this guy, Laurent Sushi. And he looks at me and Gene and he says, they have 9 months to come up with a name and they name him Laurent Sushi. You just gotta love stuff like that. And then finally, I'll say about Bobby Heenan, and then I'll take another question if you want. But Nick Bockwinkel was going to wrestle Mad Dog Vachon on one of the annual Thanksgiving night cards. And these were great. On Thanksgiving, for many, many years, the AWA would have a card on Thanksgiving night. And they promoted it like this. They said, you know what? You get together with the family, you're tired of arguing with Uncle Bill, you had your turkey, come on out to the auditorium and watch the wrestling, okay? So Nick is going to wrestle against Mad Dog Vachon. Now, Mad Dog was a good guy, but he was still a bad guy because he wrestled like a bad guy. But he was a favorite over Nick. And on this particular night, Bobby Heenan had come out. And he's got a newspaper in his hand, folded newspaper, like you used to get with the paper boy on your front step. He's got that newspaper and he's slapping his hand. And he says to Mean Gene, he says, he's slapping his hand with a newspaper, he says, you know what you do against a guy like Mad Dog Vachon? You slap him with the paper like you do a dog, and when he's down on the mat, you kick his teeth out, both of them. Now you think about that, okay? It was great. So Bobby he always had the one-liners. And I'm going to tell you one more Bobby Heenan story, which you just got to appreciate. He's telling Marty O'Neill that Vern Gagne is not going to be able to handle Nick Bockwinkel. And Nick has a new hold, and we're not telling you what it is, and he's going to eliminate Gagne once and for all. And he's got a magazine in front of him with Mean Gene, and he says, or with Marty O'Neill, and he said, Vern Gagne cannot handle this. And he opens the magazine up and he shows it to Marty O'Neill, and he says, you tell me how Vern Gagne is going to overcome this. And you could just see Marty's reaction. He goes, whoa, well, Bobby, I don't know. Well, here's what happened. Bobby didn't tell Marty what he was going to do, but he had a centerfold of a Playboy model that he had shown Marty O'Neill. And Marty wasn't prepared for it. Marty came back later and he said, I saw this, what am I going to do? You know, how's Vern Gagne going to handle this? So they used to rib each other. They used to have fun with each other. And it was quite the show. Any more questions? Yes.
Stan Kowalski.
I love Stan Kowalski. Do you know Stan, or did you know Stan?
No, back in the day, my dad did real estate on the east side of St. Paul, and the Pioneer Press guy would come and give him tickets, and then us kids would, we had to, say who would go to the restaurant.
Okay.
But yeah, so I saw him, and Tiny Mills I saw that too. Yeah.
Stan Crusher Kowalski back in the day. He was Crusher with a K, not with a C. And with Tiny Mills, when Vern Gagne started the AWA back in 1960, he had wrestled in Minneapolis all through the 50s, Vern did, but we were still NWA territory back in those days. And his first tag team champions were Tiny Mills and Stan Crusher Kowalski. They were billed as Murder Incorporated. They had and now you got to remember, this is 1959 and 60, so they had long, greasy black hair, which allegedly, now it was only allegedly, they had grease in their hair that when the referee wasn't looking, they would rub it in their opponent's eyes. And of course, the opponents couldn't see. And then when they go to the referee didn't see any foreign objects or anything. But Stan Crusher Kowalski, I tell a little bit of story in the foreword of my book. It was Stan Kowalski and Tiny Mills, especially Stan, that really hooked me and got me addicted to professional wrestling when I was 8 years old in 1959. And this is really this is going to be a short story, I promise. This is short, because I'm not going into this. But my parents were going through a divorce and they were fighting in the kitchen. And I went in 8 years old and I happened to turn on TV and All-Star Wrestling was on. And there was Tiny Mills and Crusher Kowalski doing that hair gimmick thing. And I was hooked. And from there on out, I became a fan. And I always liked Stan. I was very fortunate towards the end of the 60s, around 1968, 69, I got to know Stan personally. And he was just a teddy bear outside the ring and such a great guy. And it was so great. I mean, he was always so kind to me. And in 1972, I brought my girlfriend at the time, who's that beautiful lady in the back, is my wife of 48 years. To the matches, and she had never watched wrestling at all, but I introduced her to Stan Kowalski outside the locker room area. And Stan, in true form, he just looked at her and he said, "You could do better than him." Thanks, Stan.
Cute.
But Stan was a legitimate great wrestler friend. And when he left us back in 2017, he passed away. I was honored when his son Scott asked me to do the eulogy at his funeral. And I put him over. He was a good guy. And Vern used him in a weird way. He was Stan Crusher Kowalski. Well, when Reggie Lisowski, who became the Crusher, came to the AWA, Vern had this idea that he can't have two Crushers. You know, he wanted Crusher Reggie Lisowski to be the Crusher. So it was only obvious that he was going to have to wrestle Stan, and the loser had to give up the name. And Stan with a K lost the match. And from there on out, Vern billed him, and this is a great story too. Stan was upset about this legitimately because he always felt he could still just be wrestling as Stan Kowalski. He didn't have to give up. But Vern billed him as the Big K. That's what he was going forward.
Right.
And Stan used to tell me, he'd say, "What the hell is a big K? It's a capital letter." And he always thought that he should have just still been Stan Kowalski. And just taking that a step further with Stan, outside the AWA, I had mentioned earlier a guy named Killer Kowalski. Vladek Killer Kowalski, sometimes known as Walter Kowalski. Well, when Stan Kowalski went out east to the WWF in 1970 to wrestle for Vince McMahon Sr., Killer Kowalski was one of his big villains at the time, and Vince Sr. did not want Stan Kowalski to be billed as Kowalski. And Stan says, "I told him, team me up with Killer. We can be cousins, brothers. You know, we got the same name. Or put us in a program against each other." Well, Vince Sr. wasn't going to have anything to do with that. And Vince was stubborn. He wanted ideas to be his ideas. So he came up with the idea that Stan Kowalski had this K on his uniform, on his ring tunic. And Vince Sr. called him Crippler Karl Kovacs. All with a K.
Nope.
And he wrestled out there for that time period. And he wrestled against Bruno Sammartino, who was their big, big champion for many, many years. But Crippler Karl Kovacs. So if you ever hear that name, that was our buddy Stan. But again, he had his name taken from him. And everywhere he went, he seemed he couldn't wrestle as Stan Kowalski. Great guy. Yes.
Besides their hair, they also used their tights to like blind them.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, Stan, you know, they tell me this, and he allegedly had a foreign object in his knee that he would hit the opponent with, you know. And I don't believe that happened. I mean, I just don't. So. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
All these great stories and plot lines, and I know kind of the modern wrestling world, they have writing staffs that comes up with these things. Who was writing all these AWA storylines, plots?
Back in the day, I told you there were 26 territories, and each promoter and wrestler in charge of the day, they were the ones that came up with the storylines, what they wanted to do. So for the AWA, it was Verne Gagne and Wally Carbo. And you know, Wally Carbo, if you remember him from TV, I mean, this guy, he seemed like he couldn't put a sentence together without stumbling over his shoelaces, okay? But the reality was is that he had a real good mind for the business. And so him and Vern came up with all the storylines. Obviously, Vern had the final say, but they came up with all the storylines. And in most territories, that's the way it was. They'd have a wrestler. A lot of the promoters around the country in that era were either sometimes still current wrestlers or former wrestlers that ran the territory, and they came up with the lines. They came up with so many brilliant ideas as you can tell by just some of the things I've shared, how they tell a story and make it come to a conclusion. And I would say that when they did that, their vision was, when they come up with a storyline between two wrestlers or two tag teams, was they went out and they thought about the finish, where they wanted this to end up. So it could be 6 months, 8 months out. And then they would back up and make all the things happen to finally get to that. So it was very well thought out, like a soap opera. They wanted you to come back. And Verne Gagne said one time, like I started out earlier, I said, their goal is they had to get you to the arena from TV. But once they got you to the arena, then they had to bring you back. And usually at the arena, you know, things happened. And you had to come back and see it happen again.
And that's the frustrating part about wrestling now, is that they don't do long-term storylines because it's made strictly for TV. So they can't, there's been a couple of long-term ones, but they just, the way that wrestling is now, which I am a fan of as well, but well, I like certain things, but I mean, that's the thing I miss the most. I'm in both generations where I watch younger, and then you watch. So there's things, and I just was telling him that that's the most disappointing part, is you don't have these long culminating feuds or different things happening and building and building and building to the big blow-off cage match wherever. And that's the saddest part, is I think younger fans don't get to see those things. Everything happens within a month span.
Well, and here's the bottom line to all of that. I'm not a fan of the modern day product. I call it a product because it is very different from the era that we're talking about. But I never begrudge anybody for what they're watching today. And here's the thing. They're making money today. I mean, the business, the pay-per-views, it's all different, but it's a different generation. By the time we got to 1984, 85, 86, 87, all of the wrestlers that had been around since the end of World War II, so we're talking a 30, 40-year span here, all of those wrestlers like the Crusher and Gagne and the Bruiser, well, they were all now in their 50s and 60s, and they were retiring. And a new generation of wrestler came in. Along with that new generation of wrestler came a new generation of younger fans. And if you want to go to the AWA in 1981, 82, 83, Hulk Hogan was here. Hulkamania was running wild, okay? And Verne Gagne created Hulk Hogan. I mean, anybody that tells you that's not true, they're dreaming, because Hulk Hogan came here as a clumsy, unable to speak coherently big guy. And they originally put him with luscious Johnny Valiant, if you remember that name. And Johnny Valiant was a bad guy all his career, and he had the gift of gab like Bobby Heenan. So his job was to try and get Hulk over. And because Hulk couldn't do well on interviews, Johnny would do his talking. But here was the problem. Hogan, being as big as he was, tan, 6'8", whatever they build him at, long blonde hair, come out to the ring. One of the first wrestlers to come out to entrance music, Eye of the Tiger at the time, which was from the Rocky movie that Hulk had starred in, where he was playing Thunderlips. And before you know it, the fans were cheering Hulk Hogan. So Verne did a 180, got rid of Johnny Valiant. He just disappeared. Nobody ever heard from him again. They never even said he was gone. He just was gone. And all of a sudden, Hulk is now the good guy. But behind the scenes, Bobby Heenan, Nick Bockwinkel, Verne Gagne, and a few others worked with Hulk on his interview skills, got him to the point where he could come out and do the interview that you as a fan would remember, and he became the big star he was. And the long story short of that is that a year or two later, Vince McMahon Jr., who is 33 years old at the time, he has this big vision that he's going to take advantage of this thing called pay-per-view and closed-circuit television. And he had a vision of, all these other promoters, my dad and all these other guys of the past. I want to run my own territory, but I want to run the world.
And he needed somebody to start this going, and he picked on Hulk Hogan as his poster child, and he took him from Verne. And we could go in for the next 14 hours. It'd be a longer story than Harley Race's past. Okay? We could go into it. But the long story short on that is that wrestling changed and became what it is today. A very, very different thing.
Well, now it's a cash cow.
Yes.
Okay, back to Bobby Heenan. So when he was finishing up with the AWA, was there ever any talks of him having like a fallout with Nick Bockwinkel?
No.
No.
No. Bobby Heenan was one of the guys, to his credit, when you got to remember that when Vince McMahon started this raid on all of the territories, he had targeted Verne Gagne the most with taking Hogan, and he took Dr. D. David Schultz. You guys remember him? That was Hulk's #1 opponent here. They had a feud going where they just hated each other. Well, behind the scenes, Schultz and Hogan were good friends, and part of his agreement to leave and go to Vince was he wanted Schultz to go with him. So that's the reason Schultz disappeared. But a lot of the guys just up and left because Vince did something that was unheard of in the business at that time. He paid wrestlers to not appear on the promotion they were promised to appear on, which in the old days, it was a handshake. You're going to work for me. I'm going to pay you this amount. You're going to work for me this long. And they didn't have contracts or anything, per se. But Hogan was one of those guys where Vince told him, I'll pay you not to wrestle for him. And with Bobby Heenan, he had been contacted. And I will tell you that it was Hulk Hogan that wanted Heenan to come as well to the WWF, which it was in those days. And behind the scenes to be an adversary to it, to continue their feud. But Bobby was very professional about it behind the scenes. He went to Verne Gagne and he told him that he had been contacted by Vince and he'd been promised whatever amount of money. And he said, I will finish all of my commitments and then I'm going to go. And he did it that way. So he didn't set Verne up to not have Bobby Heenan appearing. And that was very professional. Yeah. So that tells you the kind of thing. Another guy that did that was, you have to remember, by the time we got to 1984, 85, Mad Dog Vachon was already well into his 50s. And, he had slowed down. I mean, he wasn't the terror he once was, but he could draw because of his reputation, and his interviews were classics. I mean, he still drew fans. Well, he had been contacted by Vince McMahon as well, but he was contacted for a different reason. Vince didn't want Mad Dog because he was going to make him any money in his matches, because Mad Dog was already old. And Vince was looking to the younger talent. But what he did with Mad Dog was, this was a guy that when I go into Milwaukee or Minneapolis or wherever, Vince's idea was I can have the dog on the card and the fans will come because they know who he is and because he was an AWA guy. So he was kind of doing it that way. And Mad Dog was picking up, some extra money towards the end of his career. Well, on, I don't remember the exact date, but in June of '84, Mad Dog was scheduled to wrestle against King Kong Brody, Bruiser Brody. And the night of that match, now if anybody remembers Brody, he was like Stan Hansen. He wasn't really to be trusted. But Mad Dog went to Verne right before the match was to go on that evening, and he told Verne that he was going to leave and go to Vince, that he's been promised some good paydays and he's going to be done wrestling. And he told Verne that he wouldn't, if he wanted him to, he wouldn't go out and wrestle Brody that night. Verne, to his credit, Verne could have been upset and, said, what a jerk. And, Verne could have told Brody, go and kick his, what? He didn't. He told Mad Dog, he said, you know what, I just want you to, I'm going to take you out of the match. And he brought in a substitute that night to go against Brody. And Verne took the hit on that because fans were waiting to see the dog wrestle against Brody. And they would have had a good match. But Verne was good to him and said, no, you go ahead and go. And I'm not going to have any hard feelings. So that's how that happened. Yes, sir.
How did they avoid that upset point? So you had 26 different territories, people, egos, whatever. How did they avoid Vince McMahon or that raid prior to that, with all those working entities? How do they communicate with each other?
Well, you have to remember that before 1984, in 1982, when Vince Jr. bought the company from his dad, the WWF at the time, World Wrestling Federation, all of these 26 territories ran independently. And for the most part, the wrestlers and the promoters were respectful of each other's territories. So if you promoted in Minneapolis and I promoted in Indianapolis, I didn't go into your territory, you didn't go into mine. We respected that invisible fence, okay? If I wanted to use one of your guys on my cards, I would call you. I'll give you so-and-so, you give me this guy. I mean, this is the way the business worked. And every territory, as I said, had their mainstays. So it worked really well. Well, to try to, it's always tough to make a long story short. You didn't figure that out, did you? But when Vince McMahon decided he was going to go national, he broke those boundary rules, those guidelines. And he went in, he took Hulk Hogan, Verne's #1 guy at the time. Now remember, we still had Sheik and Don Casey, we had Jerry Blackwell, we had Nick Bockwinkel, we had Bobby Heenan. I mean, we had talent, but he took Hogan. He also went in and he went down south to the Mid-South territory, which was run behind the scenes by Cowboy Bill Watts, retired at this point.
Sure.
And he took their #1 guy, Junkyard Dog. Now, to the Mid-South, the Junkyard Dog was like their Hulk Hogan. He had all this charisma. Junkyard Dog had a feud going. You remember the song by Jim Croce called Meaner Than a Junkyard Dog? Well, Junkyard Dog, the wrestler, had a big feud going with Big Bad Leroy Brown. Well, Leroy Brown was in the song. So they took the song and made a feud out of it with 2 wrestlers. But Junkyard Dog went to him. And then Vince would go to the other territories and take their top guy. He went down south, he took the Freebirds, brought him up to New York. And he took Dusty Rhodes. And a lot of this was just taking these guys to hurt all the promotions. Now, here's something that people didn't know, is that in those days, a promotion would rent out an auditorium for 10 to 12 months out. So if you get the St. Paul Civic Center, just using that as an example, they're running all kinds of events on your lawn. They've got ice capades, they got circus, they got hockey games, they got Disney on Ice, and whatever, all the different events they have. Well, wrestling was one of them. So Verne Gagne would have to book the auditorium out for whatever number of dates that he wanted, and that was his date. Well, Vince McMahon played dirty pool, and he came in and he actually paid the arenas to not rent to Verne, and he paid them more to not rent to him. So then Verne's running into a situation where I don't have a place to hold my card. Now he's taking my wrestlers. And Vince did this all over the country. So the whole expansion thing behind the scenes was literally a real dogfight. And as it turned out in the end, most of the territories, even when they tried to work together, some of the promoters were trying to team up and put on super cards against Vince. Well, then these promoters, they're old school. They were old. They were all 60, 70 years old. And they fought amongst themselves because they wanted their guy in the main event. And I want my guy in the main event. And I want my guy to win. And he wants his guy to win. And so the bottom line was Vince McMahon just watched the implosion. And the territories eventually destroyed themselves. And that's how it happened. Okay? Yes.
Female wrestlers.
Female wrestlers. I have to tell you that in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, I use this term loosely in that era where the female wrestlers were considered in that era more of an attraction, similar to what Andre the Giant was. And I say that because there were only a small group of them. There weren't a lot of women wrestlers, and most of them were booked by the female wrestler, the Fabulous Moolah. Lillian Ellison was her name, but she wrestled as the Fabulous Moolah. She was the women's champion for 100 years. I'm serious. But she was the one that booked the lady wrestlers. And what she would do back in the 50s, 60s, 70s is she would give each promotion 2 or 4 lady wrestlers to come into the territory for maybe a month or 6 weeks and wrestle around the circuit. And then those lady wrestlers would move on. So they maybe came in once a year, twice a year, but they weren't. And then the sad thing in that era was the lady wrestlers weren't taken seriously. I mean, they had as much training and background as their male counterparts. They were, you know, I guess, to be honest, if you were a guy, you were watching this match, you know, it was always the story. They were hoping, you know, they saw 2 women fighting it out. They were going to see something, you know, it just, but they were. So what happened with lady wrestling, though, is not until the late 80s, the lady wrestling was kind of brought to the forefront. And Vince McMahon, to his credit, he started that run. But Verne had Sherry Martel and Medusa Michelli here, and they were very, Vivian Vachon, she got a huge push. She was Mad Dog and Butcher's legitimate sister, Vivian Vachon. And so lady wrestling had an upsurgence. And today, you know, I don't watch WWE, but I know they have a division and it's all women wrestling and it's crazy. I can't pay attention to it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, because on occasion there'd be the females,
Yeah.
you know, that were at the show on TV and then that.
And you know, I mentioned those special cards like a battle royal card or a big blow-off match, they called them. That was the cage match at the end of a feud or something like that. Make a little blow-off match because that was it. And then the 2 guys were done with one another until another week. But the women were brought in basically on a card like that. And we've got a ladies match. I just pointed out to my wife today, it was rather weird. You know, we've come so far in our country. I saw a clipping today, and it was from 1958. And it said, the heading above the ladies match was 2 colored ladies wrestlers. Now, you know, in today's world, we couldn't do that, and we shouldn't do that. And I mean, it's just a difference. We've come a long way. So I saw a hand.
Yeah, right here. So to piggyback off the women's question. So back then you had the attraction card, like the battle royals, the women's match, and I would say, I guess the more politically correct term, little people match. So was there ever like legit heat from like other wrestlers, like, oh, she's taking my spot on the card, kind of like that. That could be me, or this person's taking my spot on the card. You understand what I'm saying?
I do understand, and yes, the answer to the question is yes. And the little people that you're speaking of, back in the day, you know, again, talking about politically correctness, back in the day, they were midget wrestlers, okay? Now, just like the lady wrestlers, there were only at the time, maybe 20 midget wrestlers. And they all wrestled, they were in a troupe together where they would go to a territory for a month period, work the circuit. They were a specialty. And again, they do that on Thanksgiving. They would advertise that, and for you kids, we have the midget wrestling. I personally, I always took offense. And nothing against the midget wrestlers, but I took offense at the fact that their matches, even a 5-year-old could see how choreographed they were, okay? They were nothing but a novelty act. And so to answer your question, yes, there were wrestlers higher up that often said, you're putting this guy, these midgets on, and you left me off the card, or I don't have a prominent spot. One very good example of that, and again, this goes back to a different time in our history. How many have heard the name Lou Thesz? Yep. Lou Thesz was a long-time National Wrestling Alliance world champion. And Lou took the business extremely seriously. He dressed in a suit. He was, depending on who he wrestled, he was a good guy, bad guy, but he was a legitimate wrestler. You did not want to mess with Lou Thesz because he'd break your leg and you wouldn't know he broke it. That's how quick he'd do it. If you didn't work with him in the ring, he was the real deal. And he respected, when he held the title, he was very respectful. Well, one of the things that Lou Thesz was adamant about, and he got his wish because he could draw money. I mean, when Lou was on the card, the gate was up. So Lou adamantly would not wrestle on any card that had a women's match or for sure the midgets. He would not, he just wouldn't wrestle them. He didn't believe that they belonged on. Now again, I don't agree with it. But on the other hand, I will tell you this, and I want to bring up the little people again. The thing that only bothered me is that the wrestlers in that era went out of their way to convince fans that what they did in the ring was real. They would never admit to you that it was predetermined or worse, they hated that word. And they went so far to tell you all the time that it was real. Well, when they bring in the midgets, and honest, you watch their matches. If you've seen one midget match, you've seen them all. They were all, it was a repeat every single match. They were so choreographed. And for me, that was always tough to deal with because I'm saying, they're telling me it's real, but then they bring in this cartoon show. You know, it just didn't equate. But, and I'll be honest with you, my attendance records for all cards do not indicate that the midgets drew more money on a card. But nonetheless, they were the attraction of the day. Okay.
One more question. One more question, then we have to end the Q&A.
We're going to end it. one more question. Would be time for Dave Morris bedtime news.
Says who?
There's a curfew. There's always a curfew.
Did St. Paul or Minneapolis draw more as far as attendance?
Depended on, it actually depended on whatever the main events or the feud were at various times, equally over the years. Okay. The bottom line, guys, professional wrestling in the old days, it was real. I'm serious. It was real. But the endings were predetermined. And in the ring, the guys took care of one another so that they didn't hurt each other because they may, well, they're going to be wrestling against each other somewhere else tomorrow night. You're not going to really hurt the guy. Here's the bottom line. All these guys, when I went over the years and I've seen them after they're retired and they tell you that they are, somebody will tell them they're fake. Jumpin' Jimmy Brunzell, you guys know Jumpin' Jim. He's had his knees replaced, he's had his hips replaced, he's had his shoulders replaced. He just had another shoulder surgery about a month ago. And I asked him back in 2010, he'd had shoulder replacement. And I asked him, I said, how do you get a shoulder replacement? And he said to me, and this is true, he said, you remember all those fake drop kicks that I threw in the ring? Well, what Jim would do is he'd use the drop kick. You got to touch your opponent to go down. But when he'd go down, he'd always land on his shoulder. And you do this every match for 15 years, he wrecked his shoulder. I saw wrestlers with their ankles fused so they can't move them. Obviously, all the injuries I said, concussions. And the wrestlers, when they get asked if it was fake, they would be upset because their injuries said that they put their bodies on the line for their fans every single night, week, month out of the year. And they entertained you. And so it's an insult to them when you say they were fake. But yes, the matches were prearranged. They took care of each other in the ring, but they did get hurt. And here was the thing, they had no insurance. These guys were independent contractors back in the day. So if they legitimately got hurt, they had to work either injured or not make money. And if they broke, you'd see guys coming in. There were guys that wrestled with broken arms or a broken ankle. They worked through it. I mean, that was the business. But they went very seriously to tell you it was real. And in my book, I answered the question. I said, we'll end on this, Brent, because I know you're getting ready to turn out the lights like Willie Nelson sang. God, I love that song. Not anymore if you're going to turn out the lights. I say in my book, was it real? Was it fake? Or was it something else? And the something else, and then I explained it. And the something else is what made it special. There was a wrestler in California or in Texas named Nick Kozak. And when he would be asked, is wrestling fake? Nick Kozak finally came up, he said, I came up with an answer that I can't answer it anymore, so here's what I said. For those who believe, no explanation is necessary. For those who don't believe, no explanation will do. Now that says, and then I ended it with my own statement. I said, wrestling is a lot like Santa Claus. It's more fun when you believe. All right. Thank you. If you're interested in my book, $25. That's $5 off the cover price. $5 of the purchase I will give to the Heritage Center. And I'll be happy to sign them for you. If nothing else, thank you for a great and you'll get to hear more great stories. Thank you.
Thank you.